Hello, and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Tonight's story is called What If You Were the Lighthouse Keeper on a Foggy Island in 1910. It follows a quiet, peculiar man named Emory who accepts a post on a tiny island off the coast of Maine, where the only neighbors are gulls, ghosts of logbooks past, and the moaning foghorn that hums him to sleep. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. The boat was late. Of course it was. The fog had rolled in like a big wool blanket tossed across the sea, smothering everything in soft, cold white. Emory Bell stood on the dock of what would be, from this moment on, both his workplace and his living room. The island didn't have a proper name, just a nickname passed around by the mainlanders, Candlepoint. It was called that, apparently, because of the single sharp white spire of the lighthouse like a candle stabbed into the mossy lump of rock. Emory found the name charming, though he didn't say so. He wasn't in the habit of sharing thoughts with people anymore. The island itself was no larger than a football field and shaped like a deflated potato. It had a few scraggly pines, a path made from clamshells, and the tall white tower, which groaned softly in the wind. There was also the keeper's cottage, which leaned a little to the left, and smelled faintly of biscuit dough and seagull. Emory carried a small suitcase with 3 wool shirts, a book of sea creatures, a diary with exactly 4 blank pages left, and a pipe he didn't smoke, just liked to hold. He had thinning hair, a walrus mustache, and the kind of shoulders that looked permanently shrugged. He sighed as he stepped off the boat and into his new life. A gull squawked as if to say, finally. The first thing he did was make tea. This was mostly out of ritual. The kettle wobbled on the wood stove, which crackled contentedly, like it had missed having someone to warm. As he waited for the water, Emory poked around the cottage. There were 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for everything else. The walls were paneled with pine, painted seafoam green, chipped and faded like old beach glass. A map of the coastline was nailed above the desk, with Candlepoint marked by a tiny, hand-drawn lighthouse. Someone had doodled a smiling face on the cliffside, with ink giving the island a sort of personality. Emory nodded at it politely. He discovered a plate of crackers sealed in wax paper. They tasted like dust and salt. Perfect. There were no clocks in the house, which struck Emory as odd. But then again, time didn't behave quite the same way near the sea. He supposed it wouldn't matter when you lived by tides and foghorns. You didn't really need to know the exact minute. As the fog thickened outside, the lighthouse let out a long, droning moan. Emory froze, with his mug of tea in hand. Right, he said to the room. That'll take some getting used to. He spent the afternoon wandering the island, inspecting the lantern room at the top of the tower. The spiral staircase groaned beneath his boots, each step complaining slightly louder than the last. At the top, the lens stood tall and proud. Fresnel, he remembered. It glittered faintly, even in the dim. There was something deeply comforting about the view. Nothing but shifting gray in every direction, like standing in the middle of a dream where nothing had to happen yet. At sundown, though sundown was generous, given the stubborn fogmery, lit the beacon. It flared up like a sleepy dragon, stretching awake for the night shift. The light swept slowly, thoughtfully, across the water, catching glimpses of sea spray and perhaps, just maybe, a sleepy whale waving its fin. He made dinner, which consisted of cold beans and a slightly stunned tomato he'd brought from the mainland. It was fine. The tomato might have preferred a different ending, but Emory thanked it all the same. The stove kept the room warm. He settled into the armchair by the window and listened. Nothing but wind, water, and the occasional chuckle from a bird with poor manners. His first night was restless, though not unpleasant. The wind rattled the shutters and made a sound like someone whispering jokes in a foreign language. The lighthouse pulsed its light like a giant heart, and Emory found it oddly soothing. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin, stared at the ceiling, and tried not to wonder if the previous keeper had slept in the same bed. He tried harder not to wonder why the previous keeper had left in such a hurry. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the window. He sat up slowly. There it was again, tap, tap, tap. He walked to the window. Nothing, just fog and the vague shape of a pine tree shrugging. He chuckled nervously. Must have been the wind. And it probably was. Probably. The next morning, Emory woke to find the gull sitting on his windowsill, staring in through the glass with a look of absolute judgment. It squawked once, then flew away. You don't even live here, Emory muttered. He dressed slowly, savoring the warmth of thick socks and the faint scent of salt on his scarf. The air inside the cottage was soft, like bread. Outside, it was sharper. The fog hadn't moved an inch. Emory stood at the edge of the island, where waves tickled the rocks like fingers drumming on a table. He took a deep breath. Somewhere out there, ships moved carefully past his light. Somewhere out there, someone else was having a noisy morning. But here was just stillness and the sound of water licking stone. He didn't smile, exactly, but his mustache twitched upward, and the lighthouse blinked slowly, like it was glad to have someone watching again. Emory Bell woke to the sound of something small tumbling off a shelf. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, just a quiet, polite little plop, followed by silence, as if whatever had fallen wanted to apologize for the disturbance. The sun, if it existed, was still behind a great curtain of fog, but the faint blue haze through the curtains suggested morning had arrived unannounced. And underdressed, he sat up slowly. The bed creaked like a cat stretching. One sock was already missing. He found it clinging bravely to the bedpost like a flag of surrender by the time he'd buttoned his shirt, boiled a kettle, and greeted the fireplace like an old coworker still grumbling. Me too. The small tumble had been forgotten. Breakfast was always the same. Thick bread he sliced from a loaf so dense it had ambitions of being a brick. Orange marmalade made from last year's oranges, or possibly the year before, and a single, highly judgmental gull named Nicholas. Nicholas had declared dominion over the porch, the windowsill, and on one bold day the handle of the outhouse door. He also had a deep interest in marmalade. No, Emory said, as Nicholas stared him down through the glass. You're not getting any. Nicholas squawked once, then tilted his head in that way birds do when they're absolutely certain you're being unreasonable. A bite of toast disappeared into Emory's mouth. He chewed thoughtfully. The marmalade was both tart and sleepy-like. Someone had whispered citrus dreams into a jar and sealed it shut. The gull tapped once on the pane. Emory tapped back. Respect the boundary. Mornings on Candlepoint were slow things, like syrup. Time didn't so much pass as wander. After breakfast, Emory's day began with what he'd taken to calling the round, which mostly involved circling the island slowly enough that the gulls had time to mock him from all angles. He checked the oil in the lamp. He wrote down the weather, foggy, again, in a little green-bound ledger. He swept the spiral staircase, though it never really got dirty. He dusted the desk again. He paused by the radio, which hadn't worked since 1899, and gave it a friendly thump, just in case it felt like coming back to life. And he talked to himself, "Oh, Emory," he'd mutter, "you've got exactly 37 beans left, and a storm due on Thursday. Better not sneeze too hard." It was the sort of place where thoughts needed out-loud space. The silence was thick enough to bake by late morning. Emory returned to the cottage, where he discovered a small mystery, a sock he didn't remember owning. It was striped, blue and orange, very cheerful, much too cheerful to belong to him. He held it up like a strange artifact. Where had this come from? Had he packed it by accident? Was it a gift from the previous keeper, a peace offering from Nicholas? He sniffed it. It smelled of clean linen and mild confusion. He placed it gently on the mantelpiece, where it would remain under investigation. Tea again. Strong, a bit bitter, the kind of brew that could stand up and do push-ups if asked. Emory sipped it while flipping through his sea creature book. Page 92 had a sketch of a sea cucumber that looked exactly like his Aunt Miriam. That made him laugh. He told the stove. The stove remained neutral. Outside, the fog moved like a stage curtain, revealing nothing and everything in patches. A lone seal barked somewhere in the distance, probably laughing at a joke only seals understood. He made a list of things to do that afternoon. Wind the clock, still non-existent. Polished the lens again. Look for where the mysterious sock came from. Count how many pine needles the island actually had. Write to the Lighthouse office, asking for more. Marmalade number 4 was quickly abandoned. The wind kept changing the answer. He did polish the lens, though. The glass sang under the cloth, a high whispery squeak that made his ears twitch. He wondered who else had done this, years ago. Were their ears twitchy too? Afterward, he sat at the window, sketching the fog. It was a silly exercise. Nothing stays still. But he found joy in pretending. His drawing looked mostly like cotton candy, melting in a haunted teacup. Still, it was honest. At exactly not quite lunch, he retrieved a tin of sardines and ate them with a fork, too small for the job. They tasted like salt and nostalgia. A note in the logbook read, "Lighthouse extremely well behaved today." He considered giving it a gold star. The gull returned mid-afternoon with what looked like a piece of string. It dropped it dramatically on the porch, stared at Emory through the window, and squawked once clearly, expecting applause. Emory raised his mug. Well done. As the day yawned toward evening, he walked the perimeter again. He watched barnacles cling to rock with admirable determination. He waved at the sun, though it was hiding, and tipped his hat at the wind. And then, just as he turned to head inside, he saw it. A small pile of stones, perfectly stacked. 5 smooth rocks, balanced like pancakes on a plate. He hadn't done that. Nicholas couldn't have done that. He crouched beside them, examined them like a sleepy detective. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been here yesterday either. The bottom stone had a smudge of blue chalk on it. He looked around. Nothing but fog and sea and sky. He smiled softly, gently, the kind of smile you make when you hear a good story beginning. There was something curious on the island, and he had all the time in the world to find it. The next morning, Emory woke to the same gull, the same fog, and the same kettle singing its off-key solo on the stove. Everything felt familiar till he opened the drawer of the writing desk. He hadn't meant to snoop, not really. But the drawer had stuck halfway, and when he tugged it loose, a thin leather-bound notebook slipped free and thudded gently onto the floor. It wasn't his dot. The cover was cracked and scuffed, the color of old chocolate, and the corners curled inward like they were trying to keep secrets. It didn't have a title, just a small brass button to keep it shut, which popped open with a quiet little sigh. Inside, the handwriting was swoopy and delicate. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. The first page read, Keeper's Log, Tobias Marsh, 1900 to 1909. Emory sat down with a cup of tea, the fire crackling beside him, and turned the page. The entries were not what he expected. April 17, 1903, fog rolled in like mashed potatoes. Heard voices near the pine, but only saw one gull, possibly bilingual. June 2, 1905, lost my boot. Found it 3 hours later, hanging from the weather vane. Suspect mischief or wind. December 25, 1906, gave the Lighthouse a Christmas present. A red ribbon and a stern talking to about creaking after midnight. It creaked louder, spirit unbroken. Emory chuckled aloud. He felt as though he had found a friend, one who shared his habit of talking to buildings and assigning motives to gulls. The further he read, the more peculiar things became. August 11, 1908, woke up to the smell of oranges. None on the island. Window open, nothing missing. Everything slightly rearranged, like someone tidied in a hurry. October 30, 1909, dreamt of singing. Woke up with sand in the bed, Lighthouse humming like a cello. There were no obvious signs of distress. In fact, Tobias Marsh seemed to be enjoying himself, if a little too much. His entries swayed between poetic and absurd. Some days, he reported, on weather and ships. Other days, he wrote small poems to the sea. Dear ocean, you large, wet beast, stop eating my boots. Emory snorted. I like this fellow. The last entry, however, gave him pause. January 12, 1910, wind from the east again. Clock stopped, light flickered, then held. Think it's time. Not afraid. Just tired of wondering whether it's the fog or the stories inside it. Farewell, dear Candlepoint. You've been a strange friend. That was it. No signature, no explanation, just a faded blue smudge on the corner of the page, the same chalky hue as the mark on the bottom stone he'd found yesterday. Emory closed the book slowly. A strange hush had settled over the room, as if even the stove had paused to listen. The fog outside leaned closer to the window pane. He felt it then, not fear, exactly, but the sensation of being watched politely, curiously, like someone leaning into the same story from another room. He placed the journal on the desk. The wind rattled the chimney, whispering something that sounded oddly like, turn the page. He shook himself and stood up. Not before breakfast, he muttered. Even ghosts should respect marmalade time. Nicholas was already on the windowsill, tapping with dramatic flair. Oh, you again. How's the weather? Still miserable. The gull cawed, as if in deep agreement. After toast and tea, Emory wandered outside, the journal tucked under his arm. He stood by the lighthouse, looked up at the lens slowly rotating, and spoke aloud. Did you know Tobias Marsh? You probably did. The wind whooshed once through the gallery deck. Somewhere below, a piece of driftwood knocked against the rocks, like a distant door being tapped. He followed the path toward the pine tree, where the voices had once been heard. According to Marsh, the fog made it feel as though he were walking inside a snow globe, one that had decided to replace snow with die-old soup. At the base of the tree, there was nothing, just needles and moss. But, as he turned to walk back, he noticed something peculiar carved into the bark. Tell the next one hello. He blinked, ran his fingers over the groove. It was old, weathered, but unmistakable. He looked up into the branches. Nicholas was there, preening smugly. You didn't do this, Emory whispered. Nicholas blinked. He wandered back to the cottage and opened the journal again, flipping past the last entry. The pages beyond were blank save one, in the center. Of that page, a single sentence had been added, scrawled in a different hand. The light is never really alone. Well, that was comforting. Sort of, maybe. Later, that night, as the beacon turned and the foghorn gave its gentle, mournful sighs, Emory sat in his chair and reread the strange little book from beginning to end. He laughed again at the poetry. He raised a toast to the missing boot. He imagined Tobias Marsh dancing barefoot in the fog to no music at all. And before he climbed into bed, he left the journal open on the desk, a fresh page ready for tomorrow. He placed a pencil beside it, then paused and added a note at the bottom of the empty page. "Hello, Tobias. The gull says hi." The stove hissed, the foghorn groaned. Nicholas snored on the WINDOWSILL dot, and the lighthouse kept watch, its light turning. Slow circles in the dark, steady and patient as a heartbeat. The next morning began with a ruckus. Not the usual gull-related chaos, but something different, more, determined. Emory blinked awake to the unmistakable sound of shouting, faint but distinct, and very much human. "Hello, anyone home? I'm slightly lost, and slightly wet." He sat up sharply, one foot tangled in his blanket, heart lurching like an old engine catching gear. Voices, real ones, and not the whispery kind the fog sometimes teased him with. He threw on his coat still warm from the fire, and hurried outside, nearly tripping over Nicholas, who squawked with indignation and flapped to the nearest rock like a betrayed roommate. The voice called out again, this time closer. "I'm looking for a lighthouse keeper, or at least a decent cup of tea." Emory turned the corner of the shed and stopped short. There, standing at the edge of the path, was a figure in a bright yellow raincoat, matching boots, and a very soggy hat that looked like it had lost a recent argument with the sea. The figure waved enthusiastically. "Ah, you must be Emory." He blinked. Yes, I am, and you are." Judith Pomeroy. "I was on the supply boat. We hit a sandbar. I decided to row the rest of the way, rather than wait for someone to tow us off. Thought it might be more fun." She said this like she'd just described taking a pleasant stroll through a sunflower field, rather than rowing solo through dense fog to a rocky island. Emory nodded slowly, as though trying to translate her sentence into the local dialect of, "What now?" "Well," he said, "you've arrived. Though I should warn you, we're fresh out of taxis, and the marmalade is heavily guarded." Nicholas let out a sharp squawk. Judith grinned. "I've brought my own jam, blackcurrant. Also, some letters from the mainland." Letters. Emory hadn't seen a letter in 6 months. He led her back to the cottage, where he put the kettle on and tried to remember how hosting worked. Did he have napkins? Probably not. Did she need one? Probably not either. Over tea, Judith spread out her cargo, a satchel full of mail, a tin of biscuits, and a map that had seen better days. Most of the letters were in brown paper, addressed in looping script, and smelled faintly of salt. "They've been sitting in the mailroom forever," Judith explained. "Apparently, no one knew if there was still someone stationed here. I figured I'd check. Plus," she added, "I like fog." Emory studied her over his teacup. She had a cheerfulness that didn't seem to mind the damp, or the cold, or the absurdity of it all. Like someone who genuinely enjoyed odd socks and peculiar weather. He picked up the top letter and froze. The name on the envelope was not HIST Marsh Judith. He said quietly, "Where exactly did they get these letters?" She shrugged. "They were in a crate labeled Candlepoint. I grabbed the whole lot." "Why?" He turned the envelope over. The postmark was from 1910. The ink faded, the paper brittle. "It's addressed to the previous keeper," he said. "From over 100 years ago." Judith leaned in. Oh, spooky correspondence. You don't think the post office is haunted, do you? I mean, Emory said, have you ever met a cheerful post office that earned a giggle? She reached for a biscuit. I vote we open it. He's not likely to come collect it himself. Emory hesitated. Then, slowly, he slid a butter knife under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of pale blue paper. Dear Tobias, your last letter was strange. Something about humming walls. Do you think it's loneliness, or the wind playing tricks again? Either way, I hope Candlepoint is treating you kindly. Don't let the fog get in your head. We miss you. You really must come home. Charlotte, he read it twice, then a third time. Judith sat quietly, sipping her tea. Well, she said eventually, that was surprisingly sweet. It's odd, Emory murmured. I found Tobias's journal. He left ... Not long after this would have arrived. Or didn't leave at all, maybe. Judith raised an eyebrow. Are you telling me the island ate him? No, he said. Just that it's a place where time gets fuzzy. She nodded solemnly. Like jam left out in the sun. He chuckled. Exactly. They spent the rest of the afternoon sorting the mailsome for Emory. A few unclaimed letters for names he didn't recognize, and a postcard addressed to the cat at the Lighthouse ATN, Reginald. They gave that one to Nicholas, who stared at it suspiciously and pecked at the corner. By sunset, Judith had made herself entirely at home. She patched a leak in the roof, told a joke about a sailor and a tuna fish that made Emory laugh tea through his nose, and discovered a drawer full of antique buttons, which she organized by color, then by mood. Now these, she said, holding up a set of gray mother-of-pearl buttons, feel like Wednesday morning. That evening, they watched the fog roll in from the gallery deck, wrapped in mismatched blankets, mugs warm in their hands. I'm only here overnight, she said. The boat will come back for me tomorrow. Emory nodded, though the idea of her leaving so soon sat uncomfortably beside him. You're welcome to stay, he said. The fog's extra dramatic this time of year. She smiled, tempting. But I think I'll be back soon. Something about this place feels ... unfinished. A pause. Besides, she added, I want to see if the gull learns any new vocabulary. Nicholas, on cue, let out something that sounded remarkably like. They both laughed. The lighthouse beacon turned slowly behind them, steady as breath, and the night settled in like an old quilt, full of strange dreams and stitched secrets. That night, Emory fell into one of those deep, peculiar sleeps that feel like they've been stirred from the bottom of a soup pot. He drifted away, listening to the soft knock of Judith's boots as she made her way to the guest bed, the fire humming quietly, and Nicholas rustling on his perch with the occasional disgruntled coo. The wind outside had settled into a soft murmur. The foghorn moaned like it was trying to remember the words to an old lullaby. And then there was the dream. At first, it was simple. He stood beneath the lighthouse, the stones slick with sea spray, the air thick with salt, and something sweeter like orange blossom, which was odd, considering no orange trees had ever grown on Candlepoint Island, unless they were extremely good at hiding. In the dream, the lighthouse didn't just stand, there it leaned, not physically, but emotionally, as though it were bending down to whisper something. The fog twisted in slow spirals, shapes shifting just beyond the edge of his vision. He heard music, not a tune exactly, but the sound of something being played perhaps on a glass harmonica, or by the wind itself through bottles. High, delicate, unsettlingly beautiful. He turned and saw Tobias Marsh. The man looked exactly as Emory had imagined from the journal entries, angry, with a slightly crooked nose, hair stuck in a permanent, ocean-blown disarray, and a coat that had definitely seen better decades. His eyes sparkled with the look of someone who frequently lost socks, but never lost hope. "Hello," Tobias said, sounding surprised. "Didn't expect you quite so soon." Emory tried to respond, but found his voice coated in molasses. All he could do was nod, slowly, like a sleepy pelican. Tobias sighed. "It's not a bad post," he said, gesturing at the swirling fog. "Bit lonely, bit damp, but the acoustics are fantastic." He bent down, picked up a shell, and held it to his ear. "Still humming," he noted. "That's good. Means she remembers." Emory, finally managed to whisper. Tobias smiled. "The lighthouse, Candlepoint. You don't think she runs on oil and mirrors alone, do you?" The wind picked up, lifting strands of seaweed along the rocks like ribbons in a parade. Tobias leaned in conspiratorially. "She listens, you know, learns things, sings back to those who stay long enough." Emory tilted his head. "Sings back." Tobias gave a sad little smile. "I stayed too long, forgot where I ended and she began. Happens more often than you'd think." Suddenly, the ground beneath Emory's feet began to rumble, gently at first, like a cat purring, then stronger. A seam cracked open in the stone floor beneath the lighthouse, and a soft golden light poured out, flickering like candlelight underwater. Tobias stepped back. "It's not dangerous," he said. "Just memory, just ... what lingers." Emory leaned forward and peered inside. He didn't fall. He floated, like the ground had decided gravity was optional today. Below, he saw a room, round, impossibly large, its walls made of books and bottles and things lost to the sea-teeny ships. Buttons, a fork wrapped in seaweed, and in the center, a desk. On it, the journal, open, pages fluttering. Tobias's voice echoed beside him. "When we write here, it stays. The island keeps what it's given." Emory reached toward the journal. Suddenly, a voice cut through the dream like a spoon through pudding. "Emory," he blinked. "Emory, wake up." The golden light dissolved. Tobias gave a tiny wave. "Tell her I liked the jam." And Emory shot. Upright, back in bed, heart hammering, tangled in his blanket like a burrito that had second thoughts. Judith stood over him, fully dressed, holding a cup of tea. "You were muttering something about singing fog," she said cheerfully. "Thought I'd better rescue you before you started sleep whistling." He rubbed his face. "You're very calm about this. I've had 3 siblings, 2 hurricanes, and 1 highly sentient houseplant. This doesn't crack the top 10. He sat up slowly. Nicholas sat on the windowsill, staring at him like, "Now you're just being dramatic." "I dreamed of him," Emory said. "Tobias," he said, "the island listens." Judith nodded, as though this were a perfectly reasonable observation. "Did he? Like my jam?" He said he did. "Well, at least someone appreciates my culinary efforts." The captain on the supply boat said it tasted like regret. They moved to the table, the tea cooling slightly, and Emory told her everything: the light beneath the floor, the shell music, the message in the fog. She listened, one elbow on the table, spoon tapping rhythmically on her mug. "I think you're tuned in," she said. "To what?" She shrugged. "Whatever Candlepoint's made of, memories, maybe, magic, damp thoughts." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Judith glanced at the clock. The boat should be here in an hour, if it didn't get eaten by kelp. Emory tried to smile, but felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want her to leave, not just because the cottage would be too quiet, or because he wanted to share more jam jokes, but because something about her presence had made the island feel more ... awake, he walked her down to the shore, where the fog had thinned just enough to see the approaching shape of the supply boat. She turned to him at the end of the path. "Right. To me. Where would I send it?" She grinned. "Post it in a bottle. Nicholas knows the way." He didn't know what to say, so he said the only true thing he could think of. "You made it feel less lonely." She touched his arm. "You're not alone. Not here, not really." With that, she climbed aboard. The boat chugged away, vanishing back into the fog like a soap bubble into a cloud. Nicholas landed on Emory's shoulder, unusually gentle. He nuzzled his beak into Emory's ear and made a noise that sounded very much like a sigh. Together, they watched the sea for a while, and Emory whispered, "She said to write, so I will." The days after Judith's departure passed like waves, gentle, slow, and each a little different from the last. Emory returned to his routines, lighting the beacon, logging the weather, feeding Nicholas, and occasionally arguing with the kettle, which had developed a whistle so shrill it sounded like it had a personal vendetta. Yet something had shifted. The silence of Candlepoint was no longer quite so heavy. It felt less like solitude and more like a quiet companion. He began to write, not just in the official Lighthouse log, where he dutifully recorded barometric pressure and tide patterns, but in letters, long, winding, meandering letters to Judith. He described the way the morning fog curled over the cliffs like a cat with cold paws, how Nicholas had taken to watching the sea with suspicious focus, and how one of the rocks below the northern ledge looked, when the light was just right, like a surprised walrus wearing spectacles. He signed each letter simply, "Still dry, still fogged, still fogged, still humming." Emory, he never addressed them with a real location, just to Judith via the fogged, and each time he folded the letter into a jar or bottle, sealed it tight, and tossed it from the cliffs. Nicholas would often accompany him, perching on a nearby rock with an expression that clearly said, "Well, this is odd, even for us." And then the fog began to whisper. At first, Emory thought it was the wind catching the edges of the stone in strange ways. But late at night, as he sat by the fire, pen in hand, he'd hear the softest sound, like a page turning, or a breath not quite taken. He'd pause, turn his head, and listen, and once, just once, he could have sworn the fog murmured back a phrase from one of his letters. "Surprised walrus," it sighed. He blinked. "Did you hear that?" he asked Nicholas. Nicholas sneezed. Another night, as he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of Judith again, not in some grand, symbolic tableau, but simply sitting at his table, dipping a spoon into a jar of jam, scribbling on the back of an envelope. In the dream, she looked up and said, "The fog is quicker than the mail." Emory woke up and found a new shell on his windowsill, perfectly clean, pale pink. He hadn't put it there. On the third Tuesday after Judith left, Emory received a reply. It was tucked into the lighthouse doorframe, wrapped in oilskin and twine. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, loopy, generous, and slightly chaotic. The letter inside read, "Dear Emory, your walrus rock is real. I saw it from the ferry on my way back. It looks like he's surprised someone stole his lunch. I'm glad the fog is treating you kindly. I've been dreaming about the lighthouse, about music and humming and someone named Tobias who insists my jam is too tart. Did you know Candlepoint has a shadow twin? No idea what that means. I might come back. Just need to see something through first. Keep writing. JPS." Nicholas is a fantastic name for a pigeon, even if he is clearly 70% seagull. Emory read the letter 3 times, then once more out loud to Nicholas, who puffed up with pride. That evening, he wrote back, "Judith, I think Candlepoint is more alive than we realized. Or maybe we're just finally listening. I found Tobias's boot print on the stairwell this morning. Couldn't have been mine, too small, also slightly singed, which is troubling. Nicholas is attempting to mimic the foghorn. So far, it's a perfect impression of a disgruntled tuba. You'd be proud. Still here, still fogged, still listening. Emory over, the next week. Odd things began to happen. The walls of the lighthouse began to hum more regularly, but now in response to certain sounds, Emory's kettle whistling, the click of his pen, even Nicholas's flapping, a drawer that hadn't opened in years suddenly slid free one morning, revealing an old key labeled Candlepoint B. Emory had no idea what that meant, but the key was warm to the touch and smelled faintly of peppermint. One night, the fog turned gold at the edges, glowing softly like a lantern parade at sea. It didn't illuminate anything, just danced gently through the air. Emory stood on the deck, eyes wide, breath caught. "Okay," he whispered. "You have my attention." The fog replied with a low, contented hum, and he began to notice more details from Tobias's journal coming to life. The pattern of seaweed curling on the rocks matched a sketch from 1910, a song Tobias had described hummed once into the wind, began playing faintly from the stovepipe every evening at dusk. Candlepoint, it seemed, didn't forget. It remembered everyone who had stayed, everyone who had listened, and now Emory was listening too. One fog-choked morning, he woke to find the beacon already lit. He frowned. "I didn't light it." Nicholas cocked his head. Inside the lantern room, the flame glowed steady, calm, like it knew its purpose. Beneath the base of the lamp, scratched into the metal with what looked like a nail, was a fresh message. "Keep writing. She's almost home." Emory stood in the silence for a long time, heart thumping like a distant buoy bell. He looked out over the water. The fog was thinner today. The following night, the fog rolled in darker than usual. It wasn't the comforting, sleepy kind Emory had grown fond of, the kind that wrapped around the cliffs like a wool sweater and made lantern light feel like the moon had come to visit. This fog was different, thicker, heavier. It came in fast, pushing against the windows with a sound like someone whispering secrets too quickly to understand. Nicholas flew in tight, circles around the room, muttering sharp coups like he was trying to deliver a weather warning without opposable thumbs. Emory stood at the base of the tower, one hand on the cool stone wall, the other holding the strange key he'd found. It had begun to vibrate, gently, like a tiny purring cat, which, frankly, was unsettling coming from a metal object. A storm was coming. He could feel it not just in the air, but in the bones of the lighthouse itself. The walls groaned occasionally, the same way a sleeping person does when they're having a mildly confusing dream about taxes, and then the fog began to sing. It started low, a tone so deep it made Emory's teeth feel fuzzy. Then it lifted, grew, changed pitch like it was tuning itself, and soon the air inside the lighthouse shimmered with it. He leaned out the window and looked across the sea. Something was moving in the distance. Not a ship there, were no lights, no sails, just ... a shape, tall, wide, as though the fog itself had decided to stand upright and take a walk. Nicholas landed on Emory's shoulder with all the delicacy of a bowling ball in a tutu. "I know," Emory murmured. "I see it too." He remembered Tobias's words in the dream. Candlepoint has a shadow twin. Maybe this was it. The humming deepened, and then, through the roar of sea and wind and fog song, he heard something else. The bell, not the usual harbor bell. This one was deeper, older. It rang 3 times, with long pauses between each one, like it was listening for an answer. Emory bolted up the spiral stairs to the lantern room. The light burned steady, almost too bright, and reflected off the swirling fog in beams that reached out across the water like fingers. The journal sat open on the desk, despite Emory knowing he had left it closed. The pages flapped in the wind, like a bird trying to remember how to fly. Words were appearing, not written with ink, trid slowly into the paper as if by heat or pressure. He leaned close and read, "The twin comes when the keeper forgets their name." He blinked. That was cryptic, and a little rude. Nicholas let out a shriek, not an angry one, but the kind birds make when they're trying to stop you from stepping on something important, like a power cord or a very small wizard. "Right," Emory muttered. "Right. Let's assume this is a test." He ran down to the bottom of the tower, the key clenched in his hand. The old supply closet had never opened in his time at Candlepoint, but the moment he held the key near the lock, the knob clicked. Inside was a narrow stone passageway, sloping gently downward, lit by the faintest glow from phosphorescent moss on the walls. "Well, sure," Emory said aloud. "Secret tunnel, of course. Wouldn't be a proper lighthouse without one." Nicholas flapped ahead, surprisingly agile in the close space. Emory followed, ducking under low arches and trying not to think about what other pigeons might be watching them from the shadows. At the end of the tunnel, a circular chamber opened up beneath the lighthouse. It was beautiful. The walls were mirrored stone, reflecting the flickering glow of lanterns that hadn't been lit in years. In the center of the room was a plinth, and on it a sphere of glass. Inside the sphere, fog, swirling slowly like a captive storm. A voice echoed softly from the walls. Tobias's voice. "She wakes when you remember." Emory stepped closer to the sphere. The fog inside it swirled faster, taking on shapes, glyphs, waves, the spiral of the lighthouse. And finally, a face, Judith's, just for a moment. He placed his hand on the glass. "I remember," he whispered. "Her name, my name, yours, this place, all of it." The sphere pulsed once, with light, then dimmed. The storm above softened. The fog began to lift, like a curtain drawn back after a very strange performance involving sea foam, pigeons, and metaphors. Emory climbed back up to the beacon. Outside, the shadow shape had dissolved. In its place, just waves, gentle, regular, slightly annoyed waves. The journal's last etched line shimmered in the light. "Memory is the beacon. Keep it burning." He stood at the window, breathing in the sea air, the remnants of storm and fog, and something older than either. Nicholas gave a sleepy chirp and curled up in a nest of Emory's old scarf, and then, as dawn broke, Emory saw a small boat coming through the mist, a familiar shape, one oar rowing slowly, the other trailing slightly crooked. Judith. She was coming back. The foghorn gave one last, gentle note, less a warning now, and more a welcome. The fog had thinned, spilling away like a whispered secret from the shore. The sea's gentle pulse matched the steady rhythm inside Emory's chest. In the quiet moments before dawn, the lighthouse hummed softly, not just a beacon for passing ships, but a guardian of memories, of whispered stories, and of light itself. Emory sat on the worn wooden steps outside the tower. Nicholas nestled on his lap, feathers soft against his sleeve. The night's cool breath brushed his cheek, carrying salt and the faint scent of wild lavender that grew along the cliffs. He thought back over the weeks, the letters sent into the fog, the mysterious tunnel beneath the lighthouse, the voice that echoed in the shadows, and the glowing glass sphere holding a storm in suspension. All of it led to this slow acceptance that the lighthouse was not just a signal in the darkness, but a keeper of quiet truths. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. pages filled with gentle sketches and note songs of the sea, shapes in the fog, the stories of those who had come before. Tonight, he would add one last message. With careful strokes, Emory wrote, "To the stars above Candlepoint, may this light guide you home, and may you find peace in the quiet glow." From a keeper who listens. He folded the note, tucked it into a bottle, and carried it up the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The beacon's flame flickered, steady and warm. As he stepped onto the platform, overlooking the restless sea, with a slow breath, Emory released the bottle into the wind. It caught the night air, swirling up and away. A small, bright promise sailing toward the endless sky. Nicholas cooed softly, a sound full of contentment and perhaps a touch of pride. The horizon blushed with the first hints of dawn. The stars began to fade, but the light of the lighthouse never dimmed. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeater, steady glow that kept watch over all who needed it. Emory leaned against the cool stone wall, eyes heavy but peaceful, and allowed himself to be carried by the gentle rhythm of the island, the waves, the wind, the flickering flame. The night closed around him softly, a blanket woven from light and quiet, carrying him into rest. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the gentle glow guide you toward your own peaceful dreams. Good night.